What if one court decision could reshape gun laws across the entire United States? Today, a major legal development is sending shockwaves through the national debate over firearm regulation. A 6-3 ruling from the Supreme Court of the United States, combined with a new push from the U.S. Department of Justice, could potentially challenge or even end assault weapon bans in several states. A major 6-3 decision from the Supreme Court of the United States is drawing national attention because of how it could influence future firearm cases across the country. While the ruling itself focuses on constitutional interpretation, its broader significance lies in how courts must now evaluate gun regulations moving forward. The majority opinion emphasizes that when judges examine firearm laws, they must look closely at whether those laws align with the historical traditions of gun regulation in the United States. This approach stems from the constitutional protections found in the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, which guarantees the right of the people to keep and bear arms. In the court's view, modern firearm restrictions cannot simply be justified by policy arguments or contemporary public safety concerns alone. Instead, courts must ask a key question. Is there a historical tradition of similar regulations dating back to the founding era or early American history? If a modern law closely resembles historical firearm regulations that existed during the 18th or 19th centuries, courts may consider it consistent with the Constitution. However, if there is little or no historical precedent for such restrictions, the law may face serious constitutional challenges. This framework has already begun reshaping lower court decisions in multiple firearm-related cases. Legal scholars say the ruling builds upon the framework established in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, a landmark decision that required courts to analyze gun laws through the lens of history and tradition rather than balancing tests often used in the past. The new ruling reinforces that same legal standard and signals that the Supreme Court expects lower courts to apply it consistently. Because of this clarification, many ongoing lawsuits involving firearm regulations, including restrictions on certain types of rifles or magazines, could be reconsidered under this historical framework. The decision does not immediately overturn specific laws, but it significantly shapes how courts across the United States will analyze gun regulations in future constitutional challenges. Across the United States, several states have enacted laws restricting certain types of semi-automatic rifles that lawmakers often describe as assault weapons. These laws typically focus on firearms with specific features such as detachable magazines, pistol grips, or adjustable stocks. States like California, New York, Illinois, and others have argued that limiting access to these types of firearms is an important public safety measure designed to reduce the potential impact of mass shootings and other violent crimes. However, these laws are now facing increased legal scrutiny following recent guidance from the Supreme Court of the United States. The central issue being debated in courts revolves around the protections guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Supporters of challenges against assault weapon bans argue that many of these rifles are widely owned by millions of Americans for lawful purposes such as sport shooting, recreational use, and home defense. Because of their widespread ownership, challengers claim that these firearms fall under the category of arms in common use, which previous court decisions have suggested are generally protected by the Second Amendment. On the other side of the debate, defenders of the bans argue that governments have long had the authority to regulate particularly dangerous weapons in the interest of public safety. They contend that certain firearm features increase a weapon's lethality or capacity for harm, and that states should have the power to limit those features to protect communities. The legal debate has intensified since the Supreme Court emphasized that modern gun laws must be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. Courts are now examining whether there were comparable restrictions in earlier periods of American history that would justify similar regulations today. Because of this new legal framework, federal courts across the country are reviewing existing assault weapon bans more closely. Some rulings have upheld restrictions, while others have questioned their constitutionality. As a result, the issue is rapidly moving through the judicial system and could eventually return to the Supreme Court of the United States for a final nationwide decision. The involvement of the U.S. Department of Justice has become an important part of the ongoing legal debate surrounding firearm regulations in the United States. As the federal government's primary legal authority, The Department of Justice plays a key role in defending federal laws and sometimes supporting state regulations when constitutional challenges arise. In cases involving firearm restrictions, government attorneys often present arguments explaining why certain laws are consistent with the Constitution and long-standing legal traditions. In the current wave of lawsuits challenging firearm regulations, the Justice Department is expected to argue that certain restrictions, including limits on specific types of rifles or firearm features, can still fit within the framework of constitutional law. Their position is likely to focus on the idea that governments have historically regulated certain categories of weapons or imposed safety-related rules without violating constitutional protections. By pointing to historical examples of firearm regulation, federal attorneys aim to demonstrate that modern laws are part of a broader tradition of public safety measures. However, the legal environment surrounding gun laws has changed significantly following recent rulings from the Supreme Court of the United States. The court has emphasized that firearm regulations must align with the historical understanding of the right to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. This means that courts are now examining whether modern laws closely resemble restrictions that existed during earlier periods of American history. Because of this standard, the Justice Department faces the challenge of convincing courts that contemporary firearm restrictions have historical parallels that justify their constitutionality. Legal analysts say this could lead to complex courtroom debates involving historical documents, early American laws, and interpretations of how firearm regulation evolved over time. At the same time, the Justice Department's participation ensures that the federal government's legal perspective is represented in these important cases. As more lawsuits move through federal courts, the arguments presented by the U.S. Department of Justice could play a major role in shaping how judges interpret firearm regulations and constitutional protections in the years ahead. The current composition of the Supreme Court of the United States plays a significant role in shaping how constitutional issues are decided, including cases involving firearm regulations. The court currently has a 6-justice conservative majority and 3 justices who are generally considered part of the liberal wing. While each justice approaches cases independently and based on legal reasoning, this balance has influenced several recent constitutional rulings that interpret individual rights, including those connected to firearms. In a GAC's 6-3 decision, the majority opinion reflects the views of 6 justices who agreed on the constitutional reasoning behind the ruling. When a clear majority forms around a particular interpretation of the Constitution, that reasoning becomes binding precedent for lower courts across the United States. This means federal district courts and appellate courts must apply the same legal principles when evaluating similar cases in the future. One of the most influential precedents shaping these decisions is the case of New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. In that ruling, the Supreme Court established a new standard for reviewing firearm regulations under the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Instead of using balancing tests that weigh government interests against individual rights, the court instructed judges to evaluate whether firearm laws are consistent with the historical tradition of gun regulation in the United States. Because of that framework, the ideological alignment of the court matters in determining how strongly that historical approach will be enforced. When the majority consistently supports the same interpretive method, it signals to lower courts that the standard is not temporary, but a central part of constitutional analysis moving forward. Legal experts say this consistency in the court's majority opinions is why recent rulings carry such weight. When the same majority repeatedly reinforces a legal principle, it becomes increasingly difficult for lower courts to apply alternative interpretations. As a result, the current makeup of the Supreme Court of the United States may continue to influence how firearm regulations are evaluated and challenged in courts throughout the country. Although the recent developments have sparked intense discussion, the decision does not automatically eliminate existing firearm regulations or assault weapon bans in different states. Instead, what it does is open the door for additional legal challenges that will likely move through the federal court system over time. When the Supreme Court of the United States clarifies how constitutional rights should be interpreted, lower courts must apply that guidance when reviewing current and future cases. Across the country, several lawsuits are already underway challenging various firearm regulations. Plaintiffs in these cases often argue that certain laws violate the protections guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. After the Supreme Court establishes or reinforces a legal standard, those lawsuits may gain new momentum because attorneys can use the court's reasoning to support their arguments. The process usually begins in federal district courts, where judges examine evidence, hear arguments, and issue initial rulings. If either side disagrees with the outcome, the case can be appealed to a federal circuit court of appeals. These appellate courts review the lower court's decision and determine whether the legal reasoning followed constitutional standards. Because different circuit courts sometimes reach different conclusions, complex legal issues can develop across regions of the country. When conflicting decisions arise between federal circuits, the issue often returns to the Supreme Court of the United States for final clarification. The court does not hear every case presented to it, but when a major constitutional question affects multiple states or creates inconsistent rulings, the justices may choose to review the matter. This entire legal journey can take significant time. Some cases move through the courts in a matter of months, but others can take several years before reaching a final resolution. During that period, existing laws typically remain in effect unless a court specifically blocks or overturns them. Because of this process, the current developments represent the beginning of a potentially long legal battle rather than an immediate nationwide change in firearm regulations. The broader significance of these legal developments lies in the possibility that future court decisions could reshape how firearm regulations are applied across the United States. At the center of the debate is how the protections of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution should be interpreted in modern society. Courts must determine how a constitutional right written more than 2 centuries ago applies to today's firearms, technology, and public safety concerns. In recent years, the Supreme Court of the United States has placed greater emphasis on historical analysis when reviewing gun laws. Rather than focusing primarily on modern policy arguments, the court has directed judges to examine whether a firearm regulation is consistent with the historical tradition of gun regulation in the United States. This approach has already influenced several major legal decisions and continues to guide how courts evaluate restrictions on firearms. Because of this framework, many current lawsuits challenge whether certain regulations, including limits on specific types of semi-automatic rifles, fit within that historical tradition. Opponents of these restrictions argue that firearms widely owned for lawful purposes should receive strong constitutional protection. Supporters of the regulations, however, argue that governments have long had the authority to impose reasonable limits on weapons they believe present unique public safety risks. The outcome of these legal debates could affect a wide range of firearm policies beyond just one category of weapons. Court decisions may influence regulations related to firearm features, magazine capacity limits, licensing requirements, and other aspects of gun ownership. As judges interpret the historical framework outlined by the Supreme Court, their rulings could either strengthen existing regulations or lead to the removal or modification of certain laws. Because multiple cases addressing these issues are currently moving through federal courts, legal experts believe the topic could eventually return to the Supreme Court of the United States for further clarification. If that happens, the court's future rulings could play a decisive role in determining how firearm rights and regulations are balanced nationwide for years to come. His story is still developing, and the legal fight over assault weapon bans is far from over. But one thing is clear. Today's decision from the Supreme Court of the United States has just raised the stakes in the national debate over gun rights and gun laws. If you want more updates and clear breakdowns of major court rulings, subscribe to stay informed. And let me know in the comments, do you think this ruling will eventually change gun laws nationwide?